So moving on then to the next presentation, we've got Dean Marshall-Say, who's a director of Artesia, and Eldos Then, who is an asset manager at Affinity. And they're going to be talking about, I think, a challenge that is very common to the industry, which is around the changes in demand as a result of COVID-19. It certainly had a big impact in my company, and I know there are many others in that situation as well. So over to you, gentlemen.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob. Good morning, everyone. I'm Dean Marshall-Say from Artesia, and in a short while I'll hand over to Eldos. So today we're going to talk about some of the insights that we've got from doing some work with, it's a collaborative project with about 15 other companies and the Environment Agency, who have all shared lots of data to try and really understand what's been going on during this period since we went into lockdown in March 2020. Look at the impact that's had on how we use water in the network, and picking up on some of the things that we've been hearing this morning about customer use at night and how much of that is actually demand rather than leakage. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand over to Eldos, who's going to give us a bit of a background.
Hello, my name is Eldos, and asset manager in network analytics from Affinity Water. I've been in the water industry for 4 years with previous background in retail analytics. Just a little bit on Affinity Water. We are a water-only company with our commitment to deliver high-quality water service to our customers. So we provide about 900 million litres of water every day to a population of 3.6 million people. We cover parts of Bedfordshire, Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Essex, Hertfordshire, Surrey, and some borough in London. We also supply water to the Tendring Peninsula in Essex and Folkestone and Dover areas in Kent. So I do not think anyone is expecting a pandemic of this scale in the beginning of 2020. As my CEO has put it, once in a 100-year global pandemic. Nothing has prepared us for lockdown and prolonged working from home or homeschooling. And nothing has prepared us for the increase of consumption due to the heightened regime of hygiene. But one area that gave Affinity Water a big surprise is the apparent leakage of approximately 20 megalitre, as you can see from the slide, through the summer of 2020. Over M6, Affinity Water had worked hard to reduce leakage to meet our M6 target. So we're not going to let this momentum slip at the start of M7, but come this 20 megalitre increase over the summer. Like all other companies, we scour and analyze the data to try to understand this increase. Hence, this presentation to share our findings on night use during COVID in leakage calculation. The increase in leakage causes a few challenges for day-to-day leakage management. It is difficult on operational planning since real leakage level is masked by this changing behavior of night use and the changes of network pressure pattern. In other words, we are a bit blind on our performance on leakage reduction. As mentioned earlier, hard works continue to keep the momentum of leakage reduction, but the graph tells otherwise. It is also difficult to make follow-up plans to bring leakage below the target line. We want to be more proactive in active leakage control using machine learning on leakage pattern, but this month forces us to be functioning reactively. This increase in leakage also cause further complication on understanding the water balance closure, which coupled with increased consumption. To get a grip of where we are at leakage, we work with our long-time partners at Artesia to understand the changes to the night usage pattern during COVID. Just as a fact, Affinity Water is one of the water companies that has extensive fast lock DMAs. We currently have about close to 400 DMA out of our 1,200 DMAs, which are fast lock. And this 10-second flow data allow us to understand the COVID impact to night use. I'm going to pass over to Dean to explain what we have been doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Eldos. If you can move on to the next slide. Great, thank you. Well, so I'm going to start by looking at putting this slide up and looking at how the network flow patterns have changed since the introduction of COVID-19. This is showing us 8 years of data from some of those fast log DMAs that Eldos was just talking about. There's about 200 DMAs aggregated into this graph. And this is showing us the flow on every day and every 15 minutes of the day for the last 8 years. We've got days along the bottom, time of day up the vertical axis, and the colors on the graph show the flow. The brighter the color, the higher the flow. So what we can see immediately for the first 7 days is there's a very regular pattern. We can see people getting up early in the mornings during the weekdays, later in the mornings at weekends. We can see when school holidays disrupt that pattern of flow. We can see the Easter break, the summer break, the half-term breaks. You can see the Christmas and New Year break, where everybody just stays in bed longer and gets up later and uses water further through the day. Towards the top of the graph, you can see the impact of the summers over the years. We tend to see during the summers an increase in demand, particularly during the evening, but also through the day. And that becomes apparent on this graph. And I've highlighted the summer of 18, which was that long, hot heat wave we had a couple of years ago. And that shows us that flow were elevated during that period, right the way through the day. And we get back to a normal pattern of use in 2019, and then the 23rd of March happens, and we all get asked to stay at home. Businesses are closing down, people are furloughed, schools close down. We've got people asked to work from home, and immediately we see a big disruption to the flows. We can see that on day one, people are getting up later. We can see higher levels of use throughout the whole day. We can see peak levels of use in the evening, which were higher than we saw in 2018. And that disrupted pattern continues right the way through the summer. Things start to get a little bit back to normal, but still, if you look in detail, patterns have still changed right up to the end of December of this year. If you move on, Eldos. This next slide, we can see that, that we get a similar pattern if we look around the country. So these are a number of other companies, fast log area monitors, and we've analyzed them in the same way. Some have got longer data than others, but we can see back to 2018, and you can see the summer of 2018 on the left there as a bright area of increased use. Come over to 2020, and we can see consistently a disruption to the flow patterns, and it varies around the country, and we're starting to understand why that variation is there. If you look about halfway down the page, there's a particularly bright spectrogram where there was a really high increase of use during the summer. So if you're going to understand that a little bit more, we need to get under the hood and see what's going on, and start looking at what's causing that change in water use. So next slide, please. So if you remember back in lockdown, when we started, it coincided with a really hot, dry period. So one of the questions we tried to answer as well, is it just simply the weather that's causing this increase in demand? So we, in the collaborative study, were able to get 5 different individual household monitor data plus smart meter data analyzed. And this slide is just showing some of the results of that. So if you look at the top left-hand corner of the slide, we can see the results from daily household consumption of one of those monitors. This has got data going back several years before 2020. So we took that historic data, we used that data to build predictive models of consumption based on seasonal and weather impacts, and then predict that forward in 2020 using the observed weather patterns we saw for this area. And that's the sort of the blue area of the graph. And then above that, there's a brown line, which is the observed household consumption. And then what we can see is that household consumption is higher than what we predict. It's also variably higher during certain hot periods. But even on normal weather conditions during the summer, we see an increased household consumption. So that's due to something else, and that something else is to do with COVID and the impacts of the lockdown on how we use water in the home. If we drill down into that a bit more and look on the right-hand side graph, we can see how the patterns of water use have changed during weekdays along the top and weekends on the bottom. A blue bar is a change in the diurnal profile upwards, so increased consumption. An orange bar is a change downwards. And what we generally see, and we could observe, actually, it's quite interesting, pre-lockdown, so the 2 weeks leading up to lockdown, we could see people changing their behavior. We could see people staying at home and starting to migrate from the office to home. Lockdown hits, and we see a very large change in the diurnal profile, more water being used right the way throughout the day on weekends and weekdays. Some significant increases in the evening time, particularly during certain periods. But even as we get to the end, and this data, I guess, that goes up to the end of August, we still see a big change and more water being used throughout the day, weekdays and weekends, and further into the evening than we'd seen before. So that's due to both a change in behavior of how people use water in the home. And if we drill down a bit more into this data, we can separate out the internal and external use. And what we can see is that internal use is fairly consistently high during the day. The external use tends to be higher during the hot weather periods. And nothing new there, but it's the combined effect of more people being in the home for more hours, having to entertain children for longer during the hot weather, getting up at different times of day, taking their showers at different times of day. People used to shower before they go to work. Now they can shower anytime during the day. So all this adds up to quite a big change on household consumption. If we move on, Eldus. So the other area of consumption we want to look at is the commercial sector, which is also heavily impacted by COVID. And so we're quite lucky in that Severn Trent Water had the foresight several years ago to set up a non-household consumption monitor, collecting 15-minute data from about 3,500 properties in 2016, and they've been continuing monitoring that ever since. And they made all that data available to the collaborative project, and this is some of the results from analysing that. And because we've got a really good, stable pre-COVID period, we can again build consumption models for the commercial sector and take into account all the normal seasonal activities, school periods, etc. Project that forward to 2020, look at what we think non-household consumption would have been in 2020, and then look at the observed differences. And this is what we're seeing on the left-hand graph. And we can see that by and large, if we take the whole sample right in lockdown, there was about a 40% reduction in the amount of commercial use. And that's quite a large bit, considering that many businesses were still functioning, most utilities, the whole health sector functioning normal or increased from normal. But when you look at some of the specifics in that, and we can break these down by SIC code and look at sport and recreation, hotels and restaurants, etc. Some of those sectors were 80% reduced through that period. That's a significant reduction. The graphs on the right show some of the daily profiles and different lines for different periods of lockdown. And there's some significant changes there. But one of the big changes is that the ratio between day use and night use is quite different for some of those sectors. And because when we try and quantify night use from commercial sector for reporting, we tend to build models based on their average daily consumption and predict night use, then those models that are built pre-COVID have now been compromised. And so they need to be updated and changed so that we can more accurately predict night use from the commercial sector. So I'm now going to move back to leakage and the particular issue that Eldus identified, and having understood what's going on within the households and within the non-households, we can start to look at the bigger picture on the network. So next slide, Eldos. So we've been, as Eldos mentioned, we've been working with Affinity for a number of years, helping them get the most out of their fast log areas. Because of the quality of the data we get from those areas and the consistency over time, we've built seasonal models to make sure we pick up all of the seasonal variation in night use for every day of the year over the past 4 or 5 years, and that's been used for reporting leakage more accurately over that period. What we found in 2020, though, was that those patterns of use had changed significantly. So we looked at the leakage data with Eldos and his team, and we agreed that actually, when you look at the ALC activity, look at the burst data, then the apparent increase we saw at the beginning of 20 MLD during the summer was probably not leakage, probably more to do with changes in consumption during the night. So just before Christmas, we spent some time rebuilding those models using the COVID consumption patterns along with the previous historic consumption patterns. And what we came up with was a model which showed that on top of the normal night use that we'd have seen, which is basically that green part of the graph, we can see additional seasonal weather related night use and additional behavior, COVID behaving night use patterns on top of that, which are giving us an increased customer use during the night time. Still largely coincident with the weather patterns, but it's the combined impact of COVID plus the weather that's led to that increase. And when we apply those night use values onto the minimum night flows, then we can effectively the leakage is then fairly consistent over the summer with a few ups and downs, obviously, but it gives us a much better picture. And this allows Affinity to both more accurately report their leakage this year during that difficult period, but more importantly, because we're not out of this yet, and we don't really know when these impacts are going to end. It's quite likely that there'll be some residual impact from lockdown going through the summer, and this should allow Eldos and his team to be able to react more quickly to any changes going forward in time by using the information and the insight we've got from COVID. So if you go to the last slide, Eldos. So I think one of the things is nobody could have predicted COVID and the impact it's had, and it's interesting to reflect on this collaborative project. When we started, the project team and the people who were providing data said, well, let's just provide data up to the end of September because schools will be back and everybody will be back to normal. And here we are still in the middle of lockdown. So it's had a big impact on the way the patterns of water use have changed in the network. It's led to difficulty in both reporting leakage, but also how you target and specifically locate leakage in certain areas. And we have a situation where we're uncertain what's going to happen going forward. It's pretty clear that more people are going to be working from home over the certainly short to medium and even the longer term. So it's going to be important that we take the lessons of this collaborative project and apply it. And if we're going to have better resilience going forward, we're going to need to be using our data more efficiently and reacting quicker to changes. And through the collaborative project, we've been able to look at a lot of sub-daily household, non-household data, which has helped us understand what's going on in the network. I think we can take that knowledge and transfer that knowledge to a better understanding of what's going on in the network flows. And so even if you haven't got smart meter data in all houses, I think you can interpret what's going on in the network so you can better react in the future to help improve both leakage, pressure and demand management going forward for however long we are going to be stuck in some form of lockdown or change of behaviours working from home into the future. So I think we'll finish there, Bob, and allow time for the questions for you. I see there's a few popping up on the screen.
Yeah, thanks very much, Eldos and Dean. So just dealing with some of the questions on the screen first. From Steve Toombs is asking if non-household consumption reduction by 40% is reflected in non-household night usage as well.
So yes, well, it's not the same, I think, Steve. So as I mentioned in the slide we saw earlier, we've been looking at and quantifying the ratio between day use and night use, and that's definitely changed during different periods of lockdown. It's different for some sectors, and so one of the outputs of this collaborative project, we're providing data on how that's changed. Now, different people assess their night use in commercial sectors in different ways, but fundamentally, I think that means that you've got to look in more detail at the data you've collected during 2020 to get a good understanding of that.
Okay, another question, Jeremy is asking whether you've seen any difference between household metered and unmetered consumption as a result of COVID.
Yes, we have. I mean, measured households tend to have a lower consumption to start with, and what we saw during 2018, in fact, when we had a really heat wave, was that measured households had a suppressed consumption during 2018 heat wave compared to unmeasured households. I think, and we're still doing the final bits of the analysis on this, I think that we're seeing less suppression. I think measured households have also increased their consumption during that period, and I think that's born out of necessity. I think more than anything, you've got all people there during the home. You can't keep your consumption down, so yes, it's increased. But we've also seen measured households having an increase in their external use as well. So they're people are part of this project. We did a short social science study with Manchester University, and we had a question panel sessions with people around the country. And it was very clear that people saw things like the garden as an important place for relaxing, to get away from the office where they're cooped up all the way through the day and the night. Get out in the garden, enjoy the garden, and along with the kids and the children and the pets, just it leads to a greater water use, either for recreation or growing vegetables and that sort of thing. So yeah, so the answer is in the short answer, measured and unmeasured both went up. And I think we see a different behavior to what we saw during the 2018 heat wave.
So what do you see, Dean, from all of the analysis that you've done, and obviously having this relatively granular data to be able to break things down in the way that you can, and what you've concluded from that? The potential impacts of what you're finding could be long-lasting, couldn't they? Depending on how long the impact of COVID lasts. And there's a lot of views that it's not going to be over and done with once we've all been vaccinated. It's going to be ever changing and developing into new strains, and and so on. So I know it's hard for everybody to look into a crystal ball at the moment, but these changes can have massive impacts on our water resources management planning processes, and what we're trying to do to mitigate the impacts of global warming and so on. So what are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, yes, I mean, it does take a big crystal ball to look at that, but what we do see and what we can start to understand is why are all these different changes happening. So I've presented some of this today, and I could have presented for a couple of hours on this, but it's not only more people in the house for longer during the day. I think the other impact is, particularly you see this in London, an exodus of people out to London into the surrounding areas. So I pointed to some of those high areas that on that graph earlier of different increase in flow in different areas of the country. Some of those, the highest ones, are in fact companies bordering onto London. And I think we've seen people who would normally be commuting to London now staying at home all day. So there's those impacts. We've got people using water differently during the day because they're there, they've got to entertain children. So whatever comes out, whether it's still a residual cyclic impact of COVID. We don't know what that's going to be, or whether it's just people actually spending less time commuting into the office and more time working at home. And I think it is going to change some of those patterns of water use. And we've built this as an industry, a water network, which has served us extremely well at supplying peak demands in the morning, less during the day, and then again at peak in the evening, occasionally getting caught out by a few really hot summers. Now those patterns of flow are going to change. And so I think it's just being aware that that things are going to be a bit different. I went to a conference during the summer on data science, which has nothing to do with water. We saw data science experiences from all sorts of different industries: banking, insurance, health sector, manufacturing, etc. All of whom said, we have lots of models which we run to help us with our business processes. Along came COVID, and we just threw them all out and had to start again. So I think what we can do with this project is trying to promote the findings from this project so that people can take these findings and help them to adjust how they look at things going forward. And it could have impacts for longer term water resources, as I said, with people moving around different areas.
Yeah, I think Joe's asked pretty much that same, or you've covered the answer to Joe's question there in terms of parameters for housing developments changing in the future, storage requirements changing, and so on. But I think the point is, this isn't necessarily just a change in the patterns of consumption, shifting from place to place within a total daily demand that stays the same. This is actually demand going up as well, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, and that's very clear. It is, yeah, definitely an increase, and it's not just a shift. It isn't just that the households come down and the non-households come down and the households gone up. It's actually a much bigger change than that.
Yeah.
And that difference might settle down as we go forward. But I think the important thing is to monitor and track and react. And if we can do that with greater insight now, then I think that will help people going forward. And I see Judith put something in the chat about carrying on this in the catch-up lounge. I'll disappear into there at 12 o'clock and happy to answer any further questions from this session.
Well, I think there are quite a lot of questions unanswered there, which again pays tribute to the great quality of the presentation that you both made. So just one final comment from me. I mean, there's a lot of major issues that people are talking about as with PR24. Actually, well, it's not around the corner anymore. It started, and one of the things that people are not talking enough about is this issue. There's a lot of discussion about lead as being a big issue at PR24, and various others as well. But this could be, as we've said, a major kind of long-term issue for the industry that we need to understand, and make sure we don't make investments in the future that are not as effective as we think they might be.
Yeah, fully agree. It has some very big implications, I think, on how we operate going forward.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks very much to both of you, Dean and Eldus. That was a great presentation, stimulating a lot of interesting questions on an issue that affects most people in the industry one way or the other. If you could answer some of those extra questions there, that would be really good, or make yourselves available in the catch-up lounge after 12 o'clock. That would be excellent. So thanks once again.